Now, ready to plunge into this very complicated passage. But the only way I know to plunge into it, after years of trying to unscramble it and teach it, so that now I think I understand it pretty well, is to put it back in the framework of the Greeks versus the Judeo-Christians, because not only do they have a big different view about epistemology and metaphysics and ethics, but they have a totally different view of the self. And I don't think anybody before Kierkegaard ever fully saw how this big difference. As you'll see when I talk about it, Pascal sort of saw it, because Pascal was a genius who sort of saw everything about existential things way before anybody else. But here we go. So, the Greek view, the self, and you don't have anything about that on your pages yet. I'm giving you the background for looking at these pages. So, on the Greek view, particularly in Plato, human beings were an unstable combination of body and soul. And the body part was in time, and the soul part was merged with the ideas, these abstract whatevers, that people are still worrying about, trying to decide what they were, but something or other outside of time, something eternal, that the eternal part of the self could contemplate and merge with. And the basic idea, in Plato particularly, is that you're an unstable combination of these two, the body and the soul. And in order to make that unstable combination stable and livable, and to lead a harmonious life instead of a life sort of struggling back and forth between the body and the soul, you need to find out which part is really essentially you and get rid of the other part. Of course, they don't come sort of labeled like one of them, namely contemplating eternal, say, mathematical and philosophical things is what's really you, and your body is just getting in the way, or that your body is really you and this kind of contemplation just gets in the way. It's up to you to take a stand on yourself as one or the other, and to then minimize and repress or whatever, get rid of or declare unessential the other part. So for Plato, when you realize you have an eternal soul, then and you will learn to emphasize the kind of contemplation you do with the soul, and you will, to talk like Plato or Socrates is saying that the philosopher, Socrates quoting Plato as saying, the philosopher should die to their body. That means that not only philosophers but mathematicians, and nowadays the kind of programmer that I talked about who would like to be rid of his body so that he could sort of program which was the important thing to do and the best part of himself all the time, not get hungry and so forth. So Plato says, die to your body, do philosophy. And but there are other people. I just pick a Roman philosopher, Lucretius, who I'll write on the board if I knew how to spell it. I think I know how to spell it, but my computer says I don't. So, and it's probably right. I think it's Lucretius. Is that what you guys think? Well, so much the worse for my computer then. Okay, so Lucretius, a Roman, I take it, thought that we were just made up of atoms, which jiggled around. He was way ahead of his time. And he thought that what we ought to do was try to get the atoms we're made up to jiggle around in the most pleasant and unupsetting and most coherent way. And the only thing that keeps us from being able to do that is all these religious superstitions and these mathematical people like Plato who tell you that the body isn't important and that you should contemplate these eternal things. Lucretius thought just the opposite. You should identify yourself with these natural needs and with your body, and ignore the bother that comes from these religious and philosophical superstitions that there's something more important, or that you are more than just this material object that could be in a certain way sort of optimized if only it didn't have these wild ideas that come from somewhere else. So, and once you realize you are either an eternal soul and play down the body, or vice versa, that you're a body that ignore these souly things, then this instability is overcome, these two pulls on you, and you can live a happy life. But that, in other words, you have to relate yourself to yourself in a negative way. That is, not that you have to think about whether you're a body or a soul, but you either you have to behave in such a way that is, if you want to have a peaceful, harmonious life and not be yanked back and forth all the time, you have to either repress, deny, and negate one aspect or the other, the body or the soul. That's the roughly Greek idea. I mean, I'm calling it Greek. It's really mostly Plato. And so if you do it right, life is a voyage from confusion to clarity, from conflict between these two aspects to harmony. And the soul is potentially harmonious. It all it has to do is realize its true nature and get rid of the other half, the inessential part, whichever way you go. If you satisfy your essential needs and get rid of what these confusing and superficial dreams or desires, then you experience peace and fulfillment. That's the promise. And that worked well for lots and lots of people, presumably in antiquity, in Greece and in Rome. But you should be used to this now. There's another perspective, obviously, that thinks that is all wrong. That is, of course, the Judeo-Christian existentialist perspective. That is, they say, but the body and the soul are equally essential. That's why, for instance, God has to get a body when he becomes incarnate, literally embodied in Jesus. That's the Hebrews don't have this choice between sitting back and contemplating or getting sort of bodily involved. They are totally involved all the time, but they're doing it, and they are still related to God some way. But it's much more harder to spell out what's going on. Clearly you need both a soul and a body, and not just as two pieces, which are both important. They are integrated in such a way that you couldn't have one without the other. They're so integrated that in Dante, he has a problem about what about these souls who die before the time when they, for one thing, everybody will get their body back at the final day of judgment. How else? Because they really aren't complete without their body. But in the meantime, God gives them a kind of loner body, which they have in paradise and in hell, waiting for the day when they'll get their real bodies back, when they will finally be complete, and the people in hell will suffer more, and the people in paradise will be happier because they'll be whole. But they don't fit together, these two aspects. Think of the aspects, one way to think about them is, one side of the self is busy acting in the world, and another side of the self is reflecting and contemplating. These are both important things the self can do. But when you're trying to do one, the other one gets in the way. If you try to contemplate, then you better get out of your active involvement. And if you try to be actively involved, you better not contemplate. I think this is a big problem in Aristotle. How many have had 25A? No, not very many. I mean, Aristotle seems to say that the highest life is contemplation, and then he also seems to say that the highest life is political involvement, and then people for 2,000 years, as far as I can tell, have been trying to write articles and books trying to get these two together. But I think they don't go together very well in the antique world. And so Pascal sees this, and sees that we are in the Judeo-Christian tradition, or at least he is, and that in that tradition, he says, what a monster then is man. What a chaos. What a contradiction. Judge of all things, imbecile worm of the earth, the pride and refuse of the universe. That's pretty dramatic. And it isn't exactly mappable onto what I've been saying. But the important thing is, Pascal is saying that we are a contradiction, which is not at all like a combination in which you can just take either the soul or the body side. We're a contradiction because we have to do justice to both sides. We are essentially body and essentially soul. You can't just decide which one you really are and dump the other. And so Pascal thinks the highest thing people can do isn't to overcome the contradiction by getting rid of half, but you live in such a way as to fully express the tension in the contradiction. You can begin to see already, as usual, that Pascal is on to sort of anguish is going to turn out to be the sort of test of whether you are really a full human being. He says, we do not display greatness by going to one extreme, but in touching both at once and filling all the intervening space. So instead of trying to purify the self of one half or the other, to find peace and happiness, which was the Greek way, Pascal thinks that avoids the tension, the contradiction, the living stretched out between these extremes, constantly sort of alive to what looks like the impossibility of living fully expressing both these contradictory things. So Pascal thinks it's a kind of cop-out to try to purify yourself of one or the other half. Purifying is repressing or denying. Now you'll see, all of this is not just interesting because it helps explain Kierkegaard, as you'll see in a minute, but I'm pointing ahead to the brothers. The brothers, Dostoevsky has an exactly identical view of the self that Kierkegaard has, though I don't think he got it from Kierkegaard. I think they both got it from Pascal and did their own thing on it. But there is one of the brothers who is trying to purify himself, to make himself perfectly soul and get rid of the sensual, as he calls it. And Pascal thinks that doing that is very dangerous. He says, man is neither simply angel or simply brute. And the unfortunate thing is that he who would act the angel acts. That is, if you're trying to be perfect, you're dangerous. Keep your eye on the brothers and ask yourself which one that's about. And so the goal of Pascal isn't happiness and peace, which you get by getting rid of one side or the other. It's this kind of aliveness. Fulfillment is a Greekish idea. It's not, the Judeo-Christian idea is not some kind of fulfillment where you just finally arrive at happiness. The bliss has to go with anguish for Kierkegaard and for Pascal. And for Pascal and for Kierkegaard, let's put it that way. And so so what do? Well, you've got a big problem. He thinks that you oscillate back and forth between pride in the part that's the contemplative soul part and despair at being this lowly animal. Remember, the pride and refuse of the universe. So you're proud of being the pride of the universe and you're humiliated at being the refuse of the universe, and that's despair. Now, what do you do about it? Well, here's where Pascal didn't have much to say, and this is where Kierkegaard takes over. Pascal says, well, Jesus had the extremest reasons to be proud since he was God, and to be humble since he was a lowly person who was washing the feet of Mary Magdalene, and he managed to live in these extremes without pride and without humiliation, and all we have to do is imitate him. Well, that's not very helpful, it seems to me, and I've read all of the Pascal that's relevant, and I don't see any more clues as to what we're supposed to do in there. And so the question is, well, what do you do when you imitate him? How does he do it? Get the two contradictory aspects together in a way that doesn't lead to conflict and bouncing back and forth between pride and humiliation, and doesn't lead to despair, but get the two aspects of the self together in a way that they reinforce each other. And so that you have more of one, the more of the other. That's what you need. That's what Kierkegaard's going to tell you now how to get. So that was the preamble. If you want to say, this is a good time to do it, because from now on, we're going to read line by line this complicated story, which is a summary of everything we said about Kierkegaard, a summary in the most condensed and abstract form you could possibly imagine. But anyway, so far so good. I don't expect there's nothing to disagree about yet. Okay. And so now we turn to this clear and condensed, and I admit incomprehensible, the writing on despair, which is, and the subject of this is, what is the self? And just an aside, which I think is funny. I mean, this is how many have tried to read it? I presume, since I gave it out, that you couldn't resist your curiosity and try to read it. And I don't know what kind of reaction you had. I think when I first read it, I just thought my head would fall off or something. I couldn't understand a thing. But at least I never thought it was a joke. Some amazingly arrogant critics and writers of Kierkegaard, who think they're on his side, so to speak, explain this passage by saying, well, no wonder you can't understand it. It's not meant to be understood. It's a joke. It's a parody of Hegel. Boy, is that wrong. And unbelievable on the part of an interpreter to think that if you can't understand it, it must be a joke. That it happens to be, and this is important to tell you, in this book of Kierkegaard's called Sickness Unto Death, which is a book about the self and despair, which is written by a pseudonym. Remember, Kierkegaard's always writing them under other people's names. The pseudonym is the name for the person who is a better Christian than Kierkegaard. I told you, there are 2 books by Kierkegaard in which he tells you what he thinks the right, really true Christian way of life is. And this passage appears in that book. And that was no joking matter, that book. And it certainly wasn't going to suddenly break off and start parodying Hegel. So here we go. And he is very influenced by Hegel. He uses Hegel language. We saw immediate and mediation and higher immediacy and so forth. Well, this is Kierkegaard taking over and transforming Hegel, because Hegel was a philosopher and didn't get it right, according to Kierkegaard. Okay, so let's read the first paragraph. The human being is spirit. But what is spirit? Spirit is the self. But what is the self? The self is a relation which relates itself to itself, or that in the relation which is its relating to itself. The self, this is getting good. The self is not the relation, but the relation's relation to itself. That's already pretty hard point. That's what that says is, what a human being is the stand that they take on themselves. I mean, we just heard the Greeks' way of relating them to themselves was either to deny the soul part or deny the body part. There are other ways of relating to the self. Pascal thought you could get it together somehow by relating to the God-man in the right way. In any case, what it is to be a self isn't just to be a set of factors, to talk in his language, but it's the way these set of factors take a stand on being this set of factors. That's what that's going on and on about, relating itself to itself. It turns out to be very important for all existentialist understandings. Heidegger, the other important existentialist I teach, says that human beings are the being whose being is an issue for them. That's Heidegger just taking over Kierkegaard and saying it in other terms. So let's go on, because there's lots to be filled in yet. A human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity, in short, a synthesis. So that's important. A synthesis, not a combination. A combination is what the Greeks had. The body there, sort of stuck with, well, the soul is, to put it this way, stuck with a body, or the body having all these crazy superstitions and kind of stuck with the soul, but you can take them apart. They're just a combination. But a synthesis, the way Kierkegaard's using it, is the two parts to require each other. You can't have one without the other. That's what it is to be a human being. It's to be this combination. Well, a combination is just the wrong word. It's to be this synthesis, this totally integrated somehow, but contradictory to something or other that has to take a stand on itself, being that way. Okay, so, by the way, let me just correct Kierkegaard here for a minute. I've always annoyed, this is the way he wrote it, but if I were reading his paper, I would correct it at this point. A human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and eternal. Do you find something confusing about that? You recognize sort of what parallelism is when you're writing? He should say of the infinite and the finite, of the eternal and the temporal. He should lay them out all the same way. You can correct it. You can do better than Kierkegaard on that. So it's a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the eternal and the temporal, of freedom and necessity. There he's back in the parallel again. In short, a synthesis. Now get ready for the next mind-blowing thing. A synthesis is a relation between two terms. Looked at in this way, the human being is not yet a self. Good grief, we've just spent a whole paragraph presumably defining the self, and now that it looks like we finished this paragraph, turns out we haven't defined the self. What we've done, look at the diagram on the back, what we've gotten so far is R1 in the diagram. That is, this human being, which is a synthesis, though it doesn't know what to do with it yet, of, and then I've got the finite temporal necessary, and the infinite eternal possible. And you can see at the bottom of that picture that the soul and the body are in there. They're sort of the Greek version. But Kierkegaard never will say soul and body, because it seems too much like you can take them apart, that when the body dies, the soul goes on, and so forth. But he's got his own names for the aspect of the body that's the important thing, namely finite, temporal, and necessary, and the aspect of the soul, which is the important thing. Only these two sets of factors, as he calls them, have to be together. You can't define them apart from each other, he's going to claim. Now, so far, first paragraph. Any problems yet? It gets worse. You will see. Okay, here we go. In fact, it's the next paragraph which to me is the hardest. I don't really quite understand why he says what he says the way he's saying it here, but I know what he's saying, so I'll read it. In a relation between two things, the relation is the third term in the form of a negative unity, and the two relate to the relation and in the relation to that relation. This is what it is from the point of view of soul, for soul and body to be in relation. If, on the other hand, the relation relates itself to itself, then this relation is the positive third term, and this is the self. That really is everything. That's the whole story. But what in the world is going on there? Well, I've told you that story. I think maybe some of you, having heard what I just said earlier, could figure this out. What is the negative relation of the self relating to itself? I bet somebody understands this. Have we talked about a negative relation of the self relating to itself when we talked about the Greeks? Makes me a little worried. Yeah.
Concept of the body and the soul being separate from one another?
That's half of it. But why would you call that a negative relation? That's only that you haven't quite got it. To help him. What's the negative? Yeah.
Because you have to deny a part of yourself.
That's it. It's a relation in which you define yourself by repressing half of yourself. That's a way of relating to yourself, which is a negative relation. That was the first clue I got. Notice that in all this abstract talk, the only example he gives is that is what, from the point of view of soul, for soul and body to be in relation. That was my clue once upon a time. And that relation could be any of these things, but he gives you one of the ways it could be this relation could work is that you deny half of the combination, and that's what he's talking about. Then, if on the other hand the relation relates to itself, then the whole self you could write in there. That would help. If on the other hand the relation relates to its whole self, instead of just repressing, then this relation is the positive term, and this is the self. Okay, what's that look like? Go back over here, and you see that's R2. R2 is supposed to be the relation relating itself to itself. That's what I put this circle around. I'm sure this can be improved upon, but this is the best I can do. So now we've got R1 is just there is this set of factors which is a synthesis. R2 is the set of factors, takes a stand on itself and tries to deal with itself being a synthesis. And now it can do it turns out, in a negative form or a positive form. Now we have to talk about that. And that's really in the italics at the top of the description. Because there you're going to hear about the forms. Despair is a sickness of the spirit, of the self, and can have three forms. Being unconscious in the despair of having a self. That's R1. That means that the person in R1 doesn't even know they've got a problem. Doesn't know they have to take a stand on themselves, and doesn't know that this is very hard to do because it's hard to, the two sides don't seem to fit together. You will find somebody, as you begin to read the Brothers Karamazov, ask yourself, who is in this despair, unconscious of the despair of having a self? And you can make yourself unconscious of it by drinking or running around with lots of women or watching TV all the time or being absorbed in computer games. The ones that my son is of that last sort. I know it well. Anyway, so what was I going to say about it? Oh yeah, for Pascal, remember the two examples I mentioned were distracting yourself by playing tennis. Little does he know how much nicer that is than sitting alone at home and playing computer games. But anyway, and the other one was sitting at home alone doing geometry. That's his little jibe at Descartes, as I said. I mean, that's another way to try to forget the problem that you're supposed to take an active stand on yourself and go out and do something, is sit alone in a warm room with no passions, Descartes says, and do philosophy or do mathematics. And those are always of not facing up to, those are always to make yourself unconscious of the problem. You try to forget what a difficult thing it is to be a human being and what you're called to do and how hard it is to do it. Okay, so now, but let's go on with the top italics. There's being unconscious in the despair of having a self. This is all put in the weirdest, awkward form. That really means, I would say, being unconscious of having a self and being sort of in despair. Because you're not really in despair because you don't even know you've got a problem. Then comes one that's clearer. Not wanting, even this one isn't too clear, not wanting in despair to be oneself. That is, if you rewrite it, something like being in despair by not wanting to be oneself, or being in despair at not wanting. I can see that it's hard to do, and it's a challenge, given 5 words to put them in the right order to describe this. But what's going on there is, well, let me ask you, do you recognize it in this cryptic form, not wanting in despair to be oneself? Try now. Does it sound familiar? It's really in code, yeah. That's great. You've got it. I feel happy that the message is getting across. Yeah, that's another version of the negative R2, the not wanting to be oneself, and you're going to be in despair because you give up trying to get the whole self together. So that's going to be which one of the brothers is in that condition? That's the same brother who's trying to be perfect. And then you have to see. And wanting in despair to be oneself. Well, that means trying with all your might to get the two sides together and not being able to do it. Because nobody on their own can get the two sets of factors together. But there's one of the brothers who is trying with all his might to get the two factors together and is in despair because he sees that he can't do it. Okay, now we can go back, I think, to where we are. Well, maybe not. Let me make sure here. So we've done R1. We've done the fact that the self is a combination. So you can't have one without the other. I'm just reading what I said to make sure because it's so dense I don't want to leave anything out. So another way to put it is what I was saying, why you can't get them together, the factors, is that they are contradictory. Or at least if you don't get the right relation to them, they're contradictory. So that you can't just say, I'm going to just put them together. There isn't any direct way for you to put them together. That's what I'm going to get to in a minute. You can't, I wrote here, express your bodily finite needs and capacities at the same time fully expressing all your intellectual needs and spiritual, religious needs and capacities. Or, to put it another way, you can't be fully involved and fully detached at the same time. In fact, the more you express one, the less you're able to express the other. If you try to fulfill both, you can try to fulfill both completely, but that struggle won't work, and then you'll realize you're in despair. So all of the cases we discussed so far are just in despair.